Hello, welcome to the next part, I believe the 7th part in my World Building Guide series, and today we are going to map our climate regions. Now, I have this all set up like I did last time because it sounds like people liked this new way of filming these, and it's way more fun and easy for me too. So in our last part, we mapped our temperature, precipitation, and aridity maps. And that aridity map and temperature map are mainly what we're going to be using in these steps to map our climate regions. Alright, so let's start with some expectations and patterns. Since we're working with an Earth-like world with the same rotation, the same number of cells, etc., the patterns in our climate region should be roughly the same as Earth. So when we get to assigning these climate regions, we will want to keep those patterns in mind so that we can scoot things around a little bit to help them make sense. There's a lot of factors that go into climate, obviously, that we didn't touch on here, but it's a good way of judging if we've made good calls in the earlier steps. Now, I've made a number of maps going through this whole guide, and each time I've noticed a few issues, I've gone back and kind of tweaked this process, and I'm sure every time I go forward, I'm going to find more little things that I want to tweak, more components or factors that I want to include, that sort of a thing. But at this point, I think it's pretty good. So, as you can see here, this is a world map of the Köppen-Geiger climate classification. And I'm going to be pulling most of the expectations and patterns from this climate system as it's described by Britannica, which I will link below, and a graphic shared by Vincent, which I will also link below. And I like using the Köppen climate classification system because it's really easy to take your area's classification and look it up online and just find lists of places that are, in that same climate region, and then you can look at pictures, get inspo pictures, kind of read about what it's like to live there. You can try to find ones that sort of match geographically similar to where that place is on your map. Look up flora, fauna, it's just a really good way to get quick and easy inspiration for what the climate is actually like in that area. So before we get into actually mapping this out, I know not everyone is super familiar with the Köppen climate classification system. I really like it, I always have, but we're going to start with a breakdown of that system for those of you that are not super familiar. So the Köppen climate classification system is divided into 5 major types. You have A, which is tropical, B, which is arid, C, which is temperate, D is continental, and E is polar. So type B, which arid, right, is based off aridity mainly, while most of the other ones are based off mainly temperature. Alright, so here you can sort of see the world map. And I just got a bunch of maps. They're not all from the same set. I couldn't find matching ones, but sets from the Wikimedia Commons. But these are all of the tropical climate regions on Earth, and they hug right around that equator line, as one would expect. So the general requirement for meeting the major type of being tropical is that you have no temperature that is colder than warm. And these will be mostly in a belt around your equator between about 15 degrees north-south, specified that you need to have at least one humid season to be tropical. And so there's 3 minor types. You have F, M, and W: rainforest, monsoon, and savanna. So I built all of these classifications that I'm sharing here. These are obviously not the actual Köppen climate classification requirements. These are based off my system. That's why I'm using my keywords from our maps, like humid, moderate, dry, warm, whatever. Those are all what means things in my system, and I have mapped sort of the equivalent temperatures back to these, requirements for the Köppen climate systems, and those systems get a lot more complicated too. There's a lot of math, and we're not doing that because math is not my thing. So just keep that in mind with this. This isn't the actual, But anyway, so rainforest, as one would expect, you need to have at least one humid and moderate or, more precipitation year-round. And this is going to typically be within 12 degrees north-south. At least that's what it is about Earth. And there's not going to be a lot of temperature variation in these climate zones because it's just very moist and humid and warm year-round. AM, which is tropical monsoon, is going to have a shorter, drier season. So typically this area will kind of lie between AF and AW climate regions, maybe around 5 to 10 degrees from the equator, but we're classifying it as one arid and one humid season, or one dry and one moderate or more wet season. AW, tropical savanna, has the largest temperature range and less overall precipitation than the other two tropical climate classifications. It has a longer dry season, and typically this will be on the edge of the tropics next to AM and then BSH and CW, which we'll get to. But we're classifying this as one arid or semi-arid season, and then seasons have to be dry and low or low and moderate. And you normally see these between 10 and 15 degrees north and south. And I think you can sort of see this on the map of Earth. Okay, so type B, arid. Now, there is an aridity calculation that's basically, there are like 3 aridity thresholds based off the average temperature and when the precipitation is received. And the threshold for aridity is lower if the majority of the precipitation is received in the winter months, higher if the precipitation is split, and then the highest if the majority of the precipitation is in the summer. And this tracks back to more like evapotranspiration, I think it's called, the hotter it is. And if the precipitation in an area is like under that threshold, it's semi-arid, and if it's 50% of that threshold, it is arid. And we created our aridity maps to sort of simulate this, right? So we're going to be referencing those maps, and for a area to meet the arid classification, both seasons have to be either arid or semi-arid, so there can be no humid season. And you'll typically see these between 15 and 50 degrees north and south. So there's 2 next steps, and you'll see these in a lot of the types going forward, is that there's multiple columns. And they're basically like, if you sort of think of them as like a tree, like, okay, we've met arid, right? So now we're either going to go to W or S. And now that we've gone to W or S, both of those can either go to H to K. H to K. And they're sort of like either your W or S, and you're either H or K, and it sort of like steps out like that, if that makes sense. W, desert, that's arid year-round. S, steppe, is you can have one arid and one semi-arid season, and these tend to be along deserts. And just as a note, if this wasn't already clear, when I say season, I basically mean half a year, because we did summer and winter. So I mean, I guess there's seasons, but like, we're not looking at all 4 seasons. We're only looking at the 2 we mapped. Just, yeah. And then we go from H, hot or tropical, and K, which is cold or subtropical, and that's just basically how cool the winter is. So hot or tropical means the winter does not get any cooler than mild. And then for K, subtropical, it doesn't get any, it's cooler than that, right? So it's either mild or warmer or cold and cooler, and that determines which one of those you are. And the rough 15 to 30 degrees north and south for tropical, and rough 30 to 50 degrees north and south for subtropical is what you'll find. We're not basing this on that. That's just a way to kind of like mentally check yourself maybe. So in general, BWH is going to be your hot tropical desert. These tend to be 15 to 30 degrees latitude, found in continental interiors, particularly on the western sides. And these tend to be lower in elevation, typically next to BSH and BWK. So then BWK, which is a subtropic desert, is going to typically be between 30 and 50 degrees latitude, and it's found in continental interiors, again, particularly the western sides, again. And these tend to be lower elevations and at higher latitudes than true deserts, typically next to BWH and BSK. So next we have BSH, which is your hot semi-arid or your hot steppes. And these tend to be between true deserts, so BW whatever, and C or D, continental or temperate type climates, or, you know, closer to the poles than true deserts. And then our last one here is BSK, which is the cold, semi-arid, or steppe classification. And these are typically at higher elevations and tend to be next to BWK climates. All right, so next we have temperate and continental, and I combine these together because other than that very first classification of whether or not it's C temperate or D continental, the rest of the columns are the same. So it's sort of like you can pick C or D, and then you can pick F, W, or S, and then you can pick A, B, C, or D. So in order to fit either temperate or continental, right? Mild summers or hotter, at least one humid season, and then based off the temperature of the winter determines whether or not it's temperate or continental. Continental gets a lot colder and temperate gets a lot milder, which obvious. So the next we pick F, W, or S, and this will basically be based off the aridity. So if it's F or humid, that's going to be humid year round. W, which is like a dry winter, is going to be arid or semi-arid winter. And then S, which is Mediterranean dry summer, is going to be arid or semi-arid during the summer. So then if you get to the next column, which this is based off the temperature, you have A, hot summer, which is hot or very hot. B, warm summer, warm. C, cold summer, which for us is mild summer. And D, extremely cold winter, which is extremely cold winter, right? So as I'm sure you can sort of pick up here, right? Temperature and continental are very, very similar. Temperate is obviously more mild, more moderate, most often due to a maritime influence, while continental has more extreme temperature swings due to the continental effect of being more inland, which we've talked about both of those things in earlier videos. You will tend to see these climates between 20 and 70 degrees north and south, and you can see on this map here, it's actually marked all the different classifications, so you can see all the temperate ones. Yeah, the next map I do have all the continental ones, but these are the temperate ones, so you can sort of see the areas that they're in, and so your CFA, CWA, CWB, and CWC, which is kind of your humid subtropic bunch, typically is going to be between 20 and 35 degrees latitude on the eastern side of continent. So you can sort of see, where is it? So CFA is this color, CWA is this color, CWB is this color, and CWC is this color. And you can definitely see them on the eastern side of some of these continents. And then typically you will see these on the poleward side of AW and AM climates. And then CWB is typically near AW or CWA at higher altitudes, and then CWC at even higher altitudes. So then CSA and CSB are sort of going to be our Mediterranean climates. So CS, A, and B. And these are typically going to be between like 30-35 degrees latitude on the far western sides of continents, and they tend to be smaller strips along coastlines unless there are like large bodies of water to follow it eastward, I guess. And CSB tends to extend inland from CSA and sometimes border oceanic climates. So on our map here, CSA, CSB are going to be these two colors, so you can definitely see that in here a bit. You can see that right along here, a little bit here, right here, a little bit into this region here, and like you can see this trails in as it follows the Mediterranean, and there's your pattern. So the next one, the next bunch is going to be CFB and CFC, and this is going to be our marine west coast or oceanic climates, and that's basically CF, B, and C here, right? And this is typically going to be poleward of Mediterranean climates, between maybe 35 and 55 degrees for CFB and 45 to 65 degrees for CFC, and they tend to be on the western side of continents. CFB climates tend to be poleward of Mediterranean or CFA/CWA climates, and CFC is poleward of CFB. And I'm mentioning all of these like patterns, right? But these aren't necessarily going to apply on our world, on the world you've built, right? There's a lot of things you can do that can kind of mess with this a lot, and sometimes these patterns look really neat and tidy on the Earth map, but less so on other maps. And also keep in mind that on Earth, the continents move. There have been large-scale overtime temperature differences and ice ages and stuff like that, where you'll see a bigger change in these patterns and how all of this gets applied. So just keep that in mind. But let's move on to specifically looking at the continental climate. So here's another map with the continental climates marked in, and it doesn't have the key, but I can sort of tell you which ones they are probably, I think. But DSA, DSB, DSC, and DSD are going to be continental Mediterranean. And DSA and DSB are typically going to be between 35 and 50 degrees, either near like steppe climates, or DSA higher in elevation than CSA. For DS, you'll sort of see DSB is higher in elevation than DSA. Again, the temperatures tend to, as you increase in elevation, temperatures go down. We've seen that. And then DSD is typically between 60 and 75 degrees and higher in elevation than DSC. So you can see this is, continental to Mediterranean to any of these, essentially, is going to be our continental Mediterranean. And it gets colder than the Mediterranean for temperature did because, again, these are continental. They're going to be less mild. So I believe these you can see, if I had to guess, that's these like blue colors in here. But then DFA, DFB, DWA, DWB, right? So all of these DF, A and B, D, W, A and B. So this is going to be humid continental, and these are going to typically be between 30 and 60 degrees toward the central and eastern interiors of large continents. So I think that's these like purpley shaded blues up in here, I think. And then DFC, DFD, DWC, and DWD are going to be your continental subarctic. And these are typically going to be 50 to 70 degrees and poleward of your humid continental climates. And those are definitely these like teal colors up in here. But yeah, so this is temperate and continental climates. The next type is polar, which, I think it's pretty obvious where these areas are, right? You're looking incredibly poleward areas, very high elevation areas. So the general requirement for this classification is that summers have to be cold or colder, and none of the seasons can be arid. So these is further broken into two categories, T, so ET, tundra, and FEF, ice cap. And your tundras are typically going to be between 60 and 75 degrees along coasts, also typically between continental subarctic climates or ice caps, or, at higher elevations. EF, ice caps, are typically above 65 degrees and cover the continental interiors that would be covered in an ice cap. And these could also be in mountains at very high elevation. So I have tundra classified as cold summer, ice cap is very cold or colder year round. And you can definitely see this is going to be our ice cap. We have some ice cap up here in Greenland. And then for the most part, the rest of this is going to be tundra, which you can see up in these very northward, right? Or very high elevation areas. So like along the Andes, the Himalayan mountains. Wow, I can talk today. But I feel like this one's pretty clear. And I actually think that the polar climates are the most clearly divided because sometimes you can have overlaps, right? Just due to how the other ones are classified. And so I actually start with polar, which we'll get to. So you will have seen little cuts of this, but this is my climate classification cheat sheet for my system. The only way I could do this was by creating a cheat sheet, or I couldn't, my brain. So this is going to hopefully make it a little easier to go through and assign these regions. Mapping each classification individually is incredibly different or difficult. So if you just try to do let's mark all the BWK climates, that I've tried it, it's impossible, I don't recommend it. So I will use essentially a different color for each column and then circle all the areas in that general category to match, and then I will go through and color in each specific classification. So when I've done this on paper, I just completely circled things, and I think I actually used pencil back then because I would erase it, but you would have, each area would have a major classification, so A, B, C, D, or E, which you would circle it and mark, this is A. And then within that section, you would mark the next column, which say for arid, we're gonna either mark it W or S for desert or steppe. And you'll just be looking at your maps and be like, okay, this section of this arid area is, you know, arid year round. So we're gonna circle that, mark it W. And then you'll further go through that arid area, say, and mark it between H and K, whether or not, you know, look at the winter temperature for whether or not it's mild or hotter or cold or cooler. And then once you've done that, you can sort of be like, okay, well, this area is circled by A, W, and H, so we'll color that in, and you can sort of work through it like that. This time, I did it in Photoshop, and it was amazing because I could use layers. I highly recommend it. So I've taken screenshots throughout this process to hopefully help. I don't have a lot of drawing videos because I think that it's very hard to read when you're just making tons of overlapping circles. So I hope this makes sense to you, but if people are still confused, I can always make a follow-up video with like a more in-depth walkthrough of how to do it, but hopefully this is good. All right, so the first step is to make a key with all the classifications above and try to match it with the Köppen climate classification system if you can. Mine's not exact, but it's really similar, and sometimes it's based off what's available. So I used to do this with colored pencils, so I only had certain colored pencils available. My system tends to lean towards things showing up as arid if you don't do that one last. If you do it first, like a huge portion of your map will be arid. So that one is last. And I like to start at the bottom, then work up, and then go to arid. So I start with polar. It is the most clear. Anything that is polar is very, very obviously polar, and I work like that. It's also easy because there's only 2 to choose from, so it's like a good, like, easy starting place. All right, so E, polar. So we're gonna go through the map, and you circle all areas that are polar. So you can see here, I have all these areas here that I marked as polar, and they're either my, you know, very poleward areas or my high elevations. So you'll see that summers in that hemisphere are going to be colder below, and no seasons are arid. And I put my maps up over here so you can sort of see this, and I won't go this in depth for all of these, but you'll see that, so summers in that hemisphere, which for this hemisphere, summer is going to be right here, and those have to be colder below, which is going to be green or lower. So you can see these lines here line up with this area here that is cold or lower in temperature. And then no seasons are arid. So if you look down here in that section, you're not really going to see any arid seasons, or yeah, arid seasons. You have this little bit of aridity here, but that's kind of cut out here. And that's sort of just how you do it, right? So this is just the general polar areas. So then if we want to break that up more into ET and EF, for EF, just color in all the polar areas that are very cold or colder year round as ice caps, which I have done. And then the rest of the areas are tundra, which is pretty straightforward, which is why we start here. All right, so the next one is temperate and continental. I start by circling the areas that generally apply to either of these, which again, your summers in the hemisphere are going to be mild or hotter, and there's going to be at least one humid season. And then once you've kind of figured out what areas those are, differentiate them between continental and temperate. Continental is winters in the hemisphere are very cold or colder, and temperate is going to have winters will be mild or cold. So you can sort of see that here. Green is going to be all my temperate areas, and purple is all of my continental areas. All right, so now to the next column we have F, W, or S, which is going to be humid, dry winter, or Mediterranean dry summer. So in all of your areas that are temperate and continental, doesn't matter which one they are, circle the areas in a new color. I used orange, and label them between those three. Either they are humid year-round, and you mark them as F for humid, or you mark them as dry winter, W, if they are only humid in summer and are arid or semi-arid in winter. And then S is going to be areas that are only humid in winter and are arid or semi-arid in summer. And so you can sort of see I kind of just went through and mapped these out in the way that made sense. So like all of this is just W. This little section is S, but the rest is W. This little bit is S. All of this is W. This is W, S, S. And I kind of just went through and marked all of them, right? And this is already starting to look a little bit messy, but then we add the next column. So this is going to be, I did this in blue for A, B, C, and D. And so D, extremely cold winter, A is a hot or very hot summer, B is warm summer, C is mild summer. So I think I started when I did this with D, extremely cold winter, because that is like, if it is an extremely cold winter, it just is D, right? And then the rest, I just looked at the summer maps and was like, okay, you know, what's the temperature? And I classified it based off that. So you can sort of see there's a lot more variation in this than with the previous column, at least on my map. So then from there, we can fill in those regions. So you just go through each of these and color them in, right? There will probably be a way to do it that makes the most sense to you. It can be tricky to move through each section and not miss them all, but you can always reference your other maps to kind of remember what the sections are. If like there's a circle and maybe you colored over, you know, whether or not it was A or B and you can't remember, well, just like pull up your map and look at it again, right? This process is very fiddly, right? I tend to do all of the like CF and then I go CW, CS, and I move through like that, like kind of doing a like branch of the tree, if that makes sense. But you can see here on my map, I have a lot of this Continental down in here and up here. And then my Temperate is going to be slightly lower or less poleward would be the way to put that. And in higher elevations, right? So it matches the patterns pretty well. So, you know, it's like, okay, you know, I kind of did an okay job, right? It looks pretty reasonable. All right, so then we're going to move on to tropical. But I forgot to take a screenshot of this process. So you know what I'm talking about though. But just lightly circle all areas that would be tropical, right? So both seasons are warm or hotter, at least one season is humid. And then based off your summer, winter, solstice precipitation modeling, there is a chance of missing some of the rainfall. And this would be like, you know, okay, maybe there's a lot of spring rain or a lot of fall rain kind of a thing. Once you finish this process and you get to doing arid, if there's a lot of areas left that would be arid, in the 15 degrees around the equator, like that belt, I would extend your tropical areas in slightly to account for the fact that we could be missing some of the seasonal precipitation here, especially if it's like monsoon based. And I would also connect tropical areas that have an arid gap between them, because that basically just means that, oh, like we probably just missed the season of precipitation here because we only map 2 seasons. So like if you have, I don't know, rainforest, and then like a desert right in between them, it's probably not actually a desert. So just keep that in mind. We'll do that in our tweaking stage later. Divide your tropical areas into your 3 tropical subclassifications based off your aridity and temperature maps. And this is going to be rainforest, if it's humid or moderate or more precipitation year round. Monsoon, 1 arid, 1 humid season, or 1 dry and 1 moderate or higher. And then savanna, 1 arid or semi-arid, and seasons are going to be dry and low or low and moderate. So in theory, all the areas left are arid, but they won't necessarily be, both because some of these might be tropical, that just we miss their rainfall, or these might be something else, and they're just like, there's some fiddly bits. So basically go through all of your empty areas now and mark anywhere where both seasons are arid or semi-arid and no seasons are humid. So I've done that here. You can see that in this red color. That's just my general, these fit those arid classifications, and you can see there are places that do not have any colors. We'll deal with those later, but I basically went through then and then divided the areas between W and S, desert and steppe, and then between W and S based off how arid they are. So W is arid year-round, S is there's 1 semi-arid season, and then we'll go through next and do H and K. So here you can see I've sort of circled the areas that are W or S in blue, and then here I've added the yellow for whether or not it's a mild winter or whether or not it's a cold winter. So you can see that. And then I'll color each of these areas in either BWH, BWK, BSH, or BSK, which I have then done here. So you can see that my gaps have disappeared. I've mostly just extended all the tropical areas into those where it made sense, or whatever other colors were close by. I kind of looked at my maps and was like, does this sort of make sense? Yeah, this sort of makes sense. So this is what my map looks like with no adjustments at all. And you can see that there's a lot of hot desert. Like there's a lot of hot desert on my map, which based off this continent, like this continent is going to have a lot of deserts, right? Because in this, and so since I have mountains along here that's going to keep that precipitation that's pulled up from the oceans and traveling this way, it's going to drop down here, which you see it's, you know, tropical to temperate, and there's not going to be no moisture left once you get inland here. So like this is going to be very deserty, very dry, very arid. So now we're going to add and fix transitions. And you can sort of see, I'm just going to flip back and forth, a few differences, mainly right here, right? And some of these steppe areas I think have sort of encroached a little bit further inward, and we've added some more continental zones here, some more tropical here to fill in the areas that were arid that probably shouldn't be too far. But the things you're gonna fix. AM or tropical monsoon, add that between your AW savanna and AF rainforest climates. It's kind of a good border to be there. Again, you probably just missed the monsoon season in our modeling. Next, look at your ocean dipoles. And there can be monsoon climate zones on either side of these. So if you have an area that is, you know, maybe arid or temperate or something, but you have a dipole, you can look at whether or not maybe those would go more towards being a monsoon season and kind of account in your head for that. And then you want to add hot steppe between cold desert and Mediterranean, and you want to add cold steppe between cold desert and continental as like a border there. And then remove any equatorial deserts between AM and AW, or which is our tropical monsoon and savanna. And these areas should be one of the climates, either, you know, tropical monsoon or savanna. We missed that rainy season. But otherwise, I would just look at it, and if there's anything that looks particularly wrong, just go back and look at your maps and really think about it. And if you're like, you know, thinking about this area really should have a lot more precipitation, and maybe I just wasn't as generous in those maps, learn from that, maybe make some tweaks here. If you want to go back and redo some of those earlier maps, you can, but I think it's pretty easy to just make tweaks here as well. I will say I have gone back and redone the same map like 3 or 4 times just to get to the point where I'm like, okay, like I know how far to go in with like maritime influence, because that's something I started not being as generous with as I should. And just things like that. You'll sort of learn how you do this, right? And how you have to make adjustments to make it more accurate. But this is my finished climate map. So we're at the stage where we actually have a finished climate map that gives a really good idea of what it's like in those areas in your world. And I mentioned this earlier, it's really easy to research these areas, get more inspiration, learn more about them. And going forward, the next 3 steps are really going to be taking these climate classifications and some of the other maps we've made and really getting an even more in-depth picture when it comes to world building, in the sense of thinking about the people living there and, you know, some of the other more global patterns. So the next 3 videos, I currently plan to do large-scale weather patterns. So these are going to be areas that are like affected by like hurricane season, are areas that are going to have like, you know, tornado valley, comparable things. And then we're going to do mineralogy, which will tell you sort of where you're going to have different types of ores, where you're going to have fertile land. And again, that in general is going to be more like a regional map would be for specific like ore deposits, but this is going to be areas where like, okay, this mountain range on this part of it might have this. This area might have this, and that can tell you a lot about how cultures would have developed in those areas and where they would have developed. And then the next section is going to be soil and vegetation, which is again going to be focused on the fertility of the land, and then based off the climates and the type of soil and the geography, you can sort of tell what kind of forest would be there, whether or not this would be a prairie or a forest or a, you know, just there's a lot of different classifications that you can have between like woodlands and actual rainforests and different types of shrubland. And so we'll be getting into that. If there are any other global level topics that you want me to touch on before I start moving into regional world building, please let me know. But thank you so much for watching. I've done, you know, a lot of research for this one, and this is probably the one that I've gone back and iterated on the most, which is part of the reason why it's taken so long to come out. But if you've found any problems or issues or any ideas or cool things you want to add, please let me know down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like, please comment. And yeah, in general, same ending feel as before. If you have comments or requests or suggestions, I love to hear them. I love chatting about this kind of stuff. And if you do make your own maps like this, I would love to see them because more sample data is fun and I just find this stuff neat. But yeah, thank you, and I will see you in the next one.